They say Cold Hollow, Montana, had 2 seasons back in the 1880s. Bitter and biblical. The winter of 1883 didn't arrive. It descended, like a funeral curtain pulled tight over a town already choking on its own secrets. Snow came down in sheets so thick they buried sound. Conversations died in throats. All you could hear were boots crunching frozen mud. And the whispers. Always the whispers. Especially when he walked by. Elias Whitlow. I first heard his name in a letter tucked inside my grandmother's Bible. Brittle paper, faded ink, and a dried blood smear I really hope was just wine. The boy stares through you, not at you. I asked his name, he answered with mine. I pray I am mistaken. I pray this child is not what I fear. Excerpt from Father Declan McKenna's private journal. Dated January 1884. Elias looked 11. Give or take. He always looked 11. 3 years in that orphanage. Same short frame, same pale skin, same expression like he was 1 hymn away from telling you how you die. Round pushpin, St. Bartholomew's Parish, Cold Hollow. Father McKenna had a face like cracked leather and a soul that had already resigned from the priesthood emotionally, even if not officially. He watched Elias cross the courtyard like he was watching a storm roll in. The kid didn't walk like a kid. He moved like a man with joint pain and trauma and at least 1 dead wife. Slow, calculated, like he'd memorized each stone before his foot ever touched it. He's asking for you again, Father, whispered Sister Margaret. Her hands clutched her rosary like it was a flotation device, and God had stopped taking rescue calls. What does he want this time? That was the thing. No one ever really knew, because Elias didn't ask for things. He recalled them. He said the railroad will come next spring, she muttered. He said the mine will collapse this summer. He told me how many men will die, even named 2 of them. Pause. And he said I'll get sick. In the lungs. For the record, Sister Margaret died that August. Tuberculosis. Her lungs looked like wet paper left in a fireplace. And then there was the oak tree. Dead. Barren. Old as sin. Elias used to stand beneath it for hours. Not moving, not blinking. Just staring at the branches like they were spelling out something only he could read. Kids avoided him. Even the feral ones. Mrs. Abernathy, the matron, watched from the kitchen window with a meat cleaver in her hand. Not for cooking. Just holding. Like she might need it. That child ain't natural, she muttered to her assistant. Ain't grown a lick. And the stories he tells about people ain't born yet, they ain't right. The most disturbing incident? February 4th, 1883. Little Timothy Wright went missing. Elias told Sister Margaret. He's down in the mine. Not yet, though. Tomorrow afternoon. He wants to see what dying feels like. They found Timmy's body 2 days later, crushed under a collapsed timber shaft. He'd never been near the mines before that. The air around Elias always smelled faintly of old wood smoke and something like spoiled milk, rot masked with ash. And when he touched things, rosaries, hymn books, your hand, they came away cold. Not winter cold, grave cold. I've got more. Photos, documents. A page torn from the 1883 census lists Elias as age 11. The 1885 census? Still 11. Still Elias. Same photo. Same dead eyes. And then he's just gone. No death record. No relocation. Just erased. Or maybe he never left Cold Hollow. Maybe he just waits. For the next name. For the next death. Because somehow, Elias Whitlow always knows what's coming. Even if you don't. End part 1. Static fades into wind. Next episode. The collapsing mine. And the letter they tried to burn. Some faces haunt you because they're grotesque. Others haunt you because they're too still, too calm for the chaos they carry. Elias Whitlow? His face haunted you because it looked borrowed, like it didn't belong to the bones underneath. My grandmother used to say, "Don't look at him too long. He'll remember you forever." She worked the laundry at the Cold Hollow orphanage back in the 40s, long after Elias was gone. But she swore, and I mean full-on Bible on your chest swore, She'd seen a boy who looked exactly like him watching her from the woods, barefoot, in January. Back in 1883, Mrs. Abernathy got a glimpse too, just a moment, through the cracked pane of her kitchen window. Elias had been standing beneath the oak again, motionless like some kind of frostbitten scarecrow. And then, he turned, slowly, deliberately, like he'd just remembered you existed and regretted it. His eyes cut through the glass, through the frost, through skin and sinew, and straight into that part of your brain you don't tell your priest about. Mrs. Abernathy grabbed Mary's arm like they were about to get dragged into something ancient and bad. "Don't stare back," she whispered, "or you won't sleep, not properly. You'll dream, but it won't be yours." Later that night, Elias sat by the fire in the common room. Alone, of course. The other kids had developed a healthy instinct for self-preservation and were already tucked away under two thin wool blankets. Elias didn't seem to notice the cold, didn't shiver, didn't blink much either. Just sat there, hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for someone to die. And in the flicker of the firelight, I swear this is in the old staff ledger notes, his face seemed to shift, not change exactly, just flicker, like something older was trying to wear him from the inside out. Round pushpin 9:00 p.m., February 14th, 1883. Dr. Harrison Blackwood arrives. This is the part that gets me every time. Because Blackwood wasn't some spiritualist or town drunk. He was a man of science, of anatomy, of logic and reason and Latin words you'd need 3 semesters at Yale to pronounce correctly. And yet, even he flinched. "Where is the patient, Father?" That's how it started. Blackwood had barely set down his medical bag before McKenna hit him with the theological equivalent of a sucker punch. "He's not ill. Not in a way you can fix." Cue the sarcasm. Oh good. Nothing builds professional confidence like hearing, "You're not here to treat a person, but to witness a phenomenon." They found Elias exactly where they expected. In the dark, beside the hearth, surrounded by the smell of old soot and dying heat. The fire was out, but he hadn't moved. Not an inch. Just turned his head, slow as a hinge that hadn't been oiled in years, and looked at the doctor. "Hello, Dr. Blackwood," Elias said, like he was hosting a dinner party and not sitting in a room that smelled faintly of ash and damp wood rot. "I've been expecting you." Blackwood laughed, the way people do when they're trying to disprove reality with sound. But then Elias started talking. "You delivered me. March 15th, 1872. Blizzard. My mother died 3 hours later. You blamed yourself. You still dream about her. About the choice. Let me pause here, because this wasn't public knowledge. The death? Yes. The guilt? No." Blackwood had never told anyone what really happened that night. How he'd chosen to save the baby over the mother. How her eyes stayed open as she bled out. How they followed him even after they closed. "I remember everything," Elias whispered, "since my first breath. And before." That's when Blackwood stepped back. Physically recoiled, like Elias was radioactive. And I get it, because sometimes horror isn't loud. It's not a scream or a monster behind the curtain. Sometimes, it's a boy in the firelight who knows your secrets better than you do. Scroll from the March 1883 Parish Journal. He is not possessed. He is not divine. He is simply wrong. Like a page torn from a book that hasn't been written yet. Father Declan McKenna. Incident note. 1 week later, Dr. Blackwood left town. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't pack much. Just vanished. His house was found abandoned. Inside, surgical tools, a half-packed satchel, and a mirror, shattered from the inside. So what is Elias Whitlow? Prophet? A ghost in the shape of a child? Or maybe just a walking memory, not of the past, but of the future. Whatever he is, he's still out there. And he remembers you now. You ever stare at a photo so long it starts to look wrong? Not like bad lighting or weird smile wrong. I mean fundamentally, cosmically, off. That's what happened to Jeremiah Morse. Cold Hollow, Montana, February 1883. The wind was starting to howl again, dragging the kind of cold behind it that felt like it came from under the ground, not the sky. And in the orphanage common room, the smell of old soot, boiled cabbage, and mildew thick enough to chew, Elias Whitlow finally started to speak. "I'm what happens when something that should have died doesn't." He said it like he was just explaining the weather. No drama, no mystery, just a fact. Like death was a train he missed. 3 days after that unsettling little fireside chat, Jeremiah Morse showed up in town. You'd call him a traveling photographer. Back then, that meant he had a wagon full of glass, chemicals, and more confidence than sense. His fingers were stained with silver nitrate and bad decisions. Claimed he'd photographed barons, bandits, and one psychic woman in Denver who said she could hear ghosts through her teeth. She couldn't. But Morse? He believed in the power of photography. Believed it could reveal truth. Even truth you didn't want. Round pushpin historical incident note. "I hear you've got yourself quite the curiosity," Morse said to Mayor Cornelius Webb. The mayor, all mustache and guilt, gave that look locals give when someone asks about the thing they don't talk about. "Well, Mr. Morse, the boy's not like other children." Understatement of the century. Might as well say plutonium isn't like other rocks. What Mayor Webb didn't mention. Yeah, 3 other photographers had already tried. 1. The first ran screaming into the woods after reviewing his negatives, repeating the phrase, "The shadows are watching me back." 2. The second had a nervous collapse after developing Elias's plate. Claimed each image showed a different face, same eyes but older, hollower. "It's not a boy," he said. "It's a timeline in reverse." 3. The third was never found. Just his shattered plates and an abandoned wagon near Brimstone Creek. No signs of struggle. Just gone. But Morse? Morse thought they were the problem. Camera February 21st, 1883, 1:40 p.m. Morse set up in the orphanage parlor. A room that always smelled like mothballs, lemon polish, and buried regret. The windows were large and kind to the light, not so kind to secrets. Mrs. Abernathy insisted on staying in the room. Not out of trust, out of necessity. "Someone has to be here to put out the fire when things start burning," she muttered. That was not a metaphor. Morse arranged his plates, adjusted the bellows, lit the magnesium flash powder. It hissed like a snake preparing to strike. Elias sat completely still in the chair. Not posed, just waiting. The photographer leaned in behind the lens, muttering, "Just a little light on the eyes, son." And Elias, without blinking, said, "You'll regret this." Scroll from the unpublished diary of Mrs. Ruth Abernathy. "When the flash went off, I swear to God the light bent inward, not outward. Like it wasn't illuminating the boy. It was being taken. Like something swallowed it." Morse didn't say much after that. Just nodded, packed up, said he'd develop the plates overnight. He didn't. Round pushpin the next morning. The mayor found Morse in his wagon. Awake, eyes bloodshot, covered in developing fluid and sweat. The plate, still wet, still breathing if his story is to be believed. He'd developed one image, and according to him what stared back wasn't Elias. It was versions. 5 of them, same pose, same chair, but in each frame, a boy, teenager, a soldier, an old man with eyes like burnt-out stars, and finally, a skeleton, wrapped in the same orphanage uniform, smiling. "It blinked," Morse said. "I swear to Christ, the plate blinked at me." Scroll official incident log, February 22nd, 1883. Mr. Morse has been sedated and taken to the sanatorium. He claims to have witness time stacked on itself. The photographic plate has not been recovered. Deputy C. Langford. So here's the part they won't tell you in town records. That same week, the orphanage furnace exploded. No fire, no damage, just a noise, like a scream underneath the metal, and then silence. They found one of Morse's plates lodged inside the chimney flue, melted around the edges. But at the center, perfectly clear, Elias, looking straight ahead. But now his mouth was open mid-sentence, as if the plate had captured him mid-warning, or maybe mid-confession. And here's the part that keeps me up at night. I found a copy of that image in my uncle's attic, wrapped in oilcloth under floorboards. The house had never belonged to my family. No one knows how it got there. But every time I look at it, I swear, Elias's eyes are just a little bit closer to mine than they were before. The thing about Cold Hollow is that it forgets nothing. Not time, not trauma, not the children who never grew, and especially not the photographs that shouldn't exist. By the time Jeremiah Morse set up his gear in the orphanage parlor, he'd already started brushing off the warning signs. That was his first mistake. His second was thinking Elias Whitlow was a subject. He wasn't. He was the observer. Mrs. Abernathy was the only one still pretending this was normal. "The boy's been acting stranger than usual," she told Morse while rearranging the parlor chairs, still covered in fabric that smelled like mildew and the bottom of a trunk no one had dared open since the war. "I found him in the cellar yesterday, talking to the wall. And not just any wall, that's the thing." According to Abernathy, Elias claimed he was speaking with the previous owner of the building, a man who'd died 15 years before the boy was born. Morse, ever the rational man, dismissed it. "Children have active imaginations," he said. "Spoiler. So do people right before they go insane." But when Elias shuffled into the room, something changed. Morse would later describe it as a feeling like gravity had doubled, like something heavy had entered the space, not physically but atmospherically. And the way Elias moved, not like a child, more like a man with too many birthdays and not enough time left. Shuffling, deliberate, like he knew this wasn't going to end well, and had accepted it. The moment Elias sat down in the chair, Morse felt the first twinge of actual fear. Not because the boy looked strange, that ship had long since sailed, but because he looked familiar, like someone Morse had seen before, or maybe would see again. "You want to take my picture?" Elias asked, his voice flat. No curiosity, no amusement, just confirmation, like he was checking a box. Morse nodded. "Just look toward the camera, son. Won't take but a moment." The camera, by the way, was an enormous contraption. All brass fittings and black cloth and the faint odor of vinegar from the developing solution still clinging to Morse's sleeves. Elias tilted his head and stared at it. "The last man who tried to photograph me saw things in his pictures that weren't supposed to be there. Superstitious nonsense," Morse muttered, which is the exact phrase every doomed skeptic says about 30 seconds before everything goes straight to hell. "Photography is science, not magic." Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, but science reveals truths. Some people aren't ready to see those." And that's when Morse ducked beneath the black cloth to peer through the ground glass. And what he saw, it wasn't a boy. It was a man hunched, hollow, ancient, hair white and wild, mouth moving without sound, like someone trapped mid-confession. His skin looked like aged parchment stretched over bone. Morse gasped, pulled back, blinked, looked again. Elias, just Elias. A boy, too quiet, too still. Scroll from Morse's final field notes, recovered in the folds of his camera case. Not a trick of the light, not a reflection. I saw him older, hundreds of years older. He looked at me like I was a mistake he remembered making. Trying to compose himself, Morse inserted the plate, removed the lens cap, began the exposure. 30 seconds. And for those 30 seconds, Elias didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't even twitch. Imagine sitting across from something that looked human, but held itself like a corpse waiting to be buried. That's what Morse saw. Stillness so total it became violent. When the exposure finished, Morse capped the lens, pulled the plate and tried to smile. "That should do nicely. You should develop it immediately," Elias said, "before the image has time to change." He said it like someone warning you not to look in a mirror after midnight. Round pushpin historical incident report. February 23, 1883. Morse was last seen entering the town's rented darkroom just before sundown. The next morning, the door was still locked. When it was forced open, he was gone. No sign of struggle. Just one developed plate. Still dripping. Still warm. The image, it wasn't the one Morse shot. It showed Elias, but behind him, flickering, barely visible, were faces. Not people in the room. Not reflections. Just shapes. Old faces. Different versions of him. And one that looked like it was still being born. Scroll letter fragment from Father McKenna, dated March 1, 1883. He warned us. Not directly, never directly. But in symbols. In stillness. In things that only reveal themselves when you stop trying to understand. I fear we have photographed a ghost that has not died yet. And here's the worst part. That plate is still out there. Because plates don't burn. Not really. Glass doesn't forget. You know that feeling when the world around you just stops making sense? That brittle, breathless moment when you realize the rules you were told to live by, science, logic, Newtonian physics, none of it applies anymore? Yeah. Jeremiah Morse had that moment in a broom closet. Let me explain. Morse, our doomed photographer with the permanently stained fingers and unearned confidence, decided to develop the plate right there in Cold Hollow's orphanage. Inside what used to be the storage closet, he set up his makeshift darkroom like a man prepping for routine surgery, not a seance. He hung blackout curtains, lit a red lantern, and got to work like it was just another Tuesday. Only what he pulled out of that developer tray wasn't what he shot. I've seen the plate. My uncle had a cracked silver nitrate copy buried in a false wall in his garage, along with letters he never mailed and a rifle wrapped in Bible pages. He never spoke about Cold Hollow. Not once. But one of the notes read, "If you ever see the boy in the photo move, run. It means he sees you too." Anyway, back to the closet. As the chemicals curled and hissed in the tray, the image of Elias began to surface, but he wasn't alone. That's the part Morse couldn't process. The boy sat in the center, yes, but all around him, as if rising from fog or memory, were others. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, draped in clothing from different centuries. Civil War coats, Victorian lace, Depression-era suspenders, a toddler in a gas mask. All of them had the same ancient, heavy-lidded eyes. That same knowing expression Elias wore. Like time was something they'd already digested and forgotten the taste of. And the background, the walls of the orphanage were gone, replaced by an open field. A battlefield, to be exact. Scorched earth, blackened trees, fallen soldiers twisted in impossible angles. Smoke that seemed to bleed off the photo. And fire, there was always fire. Morse tried to speak but couldn't. His body just stopped cooperating. He watched as one of the figures, what looked like a woman in a decaying wedding dress, turned her head inside the photo and looked straight at him. She opened her mouth like she was screaming, but all Morse could hear was the bubbling hiss of chemicals and his own pulse trying to claw its way out of his ears. That was the moment he fled the room. Mrs. Abernathy found him slumped in the hallway, face ghost white, mumbling half-sentences and clutching his chest like his heart had seen something it could never unsee. "You saw them, didn't you?" she whispered. "The others," he rasped. "What is that boy?" Now, this is the part of the story that still makes my skin crawl, even after hearing it a dozen times. Because just then, from inside the closet, a sharp crack, like glass snapping under pressure. They rushed back in and found the plate split perfectly in half. Not shattered, not jagged, split, like it had been dissected by a scalpel. The image was gone. Just darkness now, except for two faint points of light glowing where Elias's eyes had been. And then, of course, Elias appeared. Framed by the doorway, backlit like a postcard from hell. He just looked at Morse and said, completely calm, "I tried to warn you. Some things aren't meant to be captured. Some images are too heavy for glass to hold. Let me remind you, this is a child. A child who supposedly hasn't aged in decades, who doesn't blink during 30-second exposures, and who talks like he's on a first-name basis with entropy." That night, Morse didn't sleep. He packed up his gear in record time, barely coherent, and left Cold Hollow before dawn, wagon wheels grinding through frost and gravel. He never spoke about what he saw again. But as he left town, he swore he heard it. Laughter. Not one voice. Dozens of them. Children's voices, echoing across the fields like wind chimes made of bone. Whispering, giggling, singing some melody only the dead remember. Back at the orphanage, Elias stood at the window, watching. Behind him, reflected in the glass, were all the other faces, peering out from behind his shoulders. Some grinning, some weeping, none of them blinking. And that was when Cold Hollow began to rot from the inside. You don't believe me? Ask yourself this. How many children's homes are still standing from the 1800s? Now ask why this exact one, was sealed off in 1902 and erased from most state records by 1911. Oh, and one more thing. Next time you look at an old photo and the people in it seem just slightly off, like they're watching you, maybe they are. You ever hear about a medical examination that left the doctor traumatized? No? Well, welcome to Cold Hollow. This is the part no one likes to talk about. Not in polite company, not in medical journals, and definitely not in confession booths. But it happened. And it started with a man named Dr. Theodore Blackwood, former Army medic, lifelong rationalist, and the kind of doctor who wore his stethoscope even when he wasn't working, like it was some kind of holy relic. 3 weeks after his first encounter with Elias Whitlow, the good doctor finally cracked. The dreams haven't stopped, he wrote in a private letter never sent, found years later behind a loose brick in his cellar. His eyes, they don't just look at you, they dig, like bone worms. Now I get it. Most people would have taken those dreams as a sign to run. But Dr. Blackwood? No. He did what academics and horror movie victims have done for centuries. He doubled down. Because clearly, stabbing the abyss with a clipboard was going to fix everything. It was a late February morning when he returned to the Cold Hollow orphanage. Everything was gray. The air, the sky, even the snow had that gritty, end-of-winter rot to it. Like something once pure that had lived too long. Blackwood told Father McKenna, I need to examine the boy, properly this time. Blood samples, reflexes, everything. Father McKenna, a man who looked like he'd aged a decade since Elias first arrived, simply said, he's been different, withdrawn. The other children avoid him now. They say they hear him talking in languages that don't exist. Classic priestly understatement. They found Elias in the library. Let me rephrase that. They found an 11-year-old child sitting in a dim room, reading Hamlet in what Dr. Blackwood described, and I quote, as the uncorrupted Middle English dialect with marginal notes in Latin which he was correcting. Yeah. Cute. When the doctor approached, Elias closed the book with the reverence of a man finishing a eulogy. You want to weigh me, the boy said. Measure me. Count the beats and blame the blood. But science can only peel back so much before it finds something that bites back. Dr. Blackwood, naturally, replied, science explains everything. Even though, by that point, his voice shook like a drawer full of scalpels in an earthquake. The exam took place in the orphanage's infirmary. A little room that smelled like old bleach, rust, and despair. You know the type. Linoleum floor curling at the corners. Metal cabinets that never quite shut. And that quiet, humming silence that only exists in places where no one wants to be healed. First, things were just weird. Elias's height? Exactly what it was 3 years ago. Weight? Same. Zero change. Not even a pound of baby fat. Heart rate? 40 beats per minute. Which should be fatal for a child. Should be. Body temperature? 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Enough to trigger a hypothermia alert in any ER. But Elias? Cool as ice. Literally. Yet completely conscious. Alert. And watching. Now, if you're thinking, well, maybe he had a rare condition. Trust me, so did Blackwood. Right up until the boy smiled. Your instruments are blind, Elias said, lifting a thermometer and placing it gently back in the tray. They measure the vessel, not the thing inside it. That line, by the way, is verbatim from Dr. Blackwood's personal notebook, recovered decades later during an estate sale. It was written in shaky pen, underneath a page where he'd drawn an anatomical diagram of the human nervous system, with an extra nerve cluster sketched behind the eyes. He circled it in red. Underneath he wrote, "This shouldn't exist, but I saw it." Look, I don't pretend to understand what Blackwood found that day. Maybe Elias wasn't a boy. Maybe he was a vessel for something old, something hungry, something that had forgotten what it meant to blink or grow or die. All I know is that Dr. Blackwood left Cold Hollow that night and never practiced medicine again. He moved to a remote cabin in Vermont, lived alone, and spent the rest of his life writing letters that were never mailed, filled with diagrams that made no sense and warnings like, "He doesn't age. He remembers things he never lived. And he is not alone in there." The final entry in his journal just says, "If you ever meet him, don't look in his eyes. That's where the others are." And the worst part? He wasn't the last one to say that. Cold Hollow is still there. And so is Elias. Probably still 11. Probably still waiting. Some knowledge comes with a price. And in this case, it only costs your sanity. There are things in this world science can't explain, but it tries anyway. Like a drunk dad trying to assemble IKEA furniture with half the instructions missing and a screw stuck in his shoe. Field Notes of Dr. Edmund Blackwood, 1897. Found sealed inside a medical bag that had been clawed from the inside. Sound of a flickering reel projector. Low ambient hum. Rain tapping on glass. So, you know how people say eyes are the windows to the soul? Well, Dr. Edmund Blackwood looked into Elias Whitlow's eyes and saw an entire neighborhood of souls staring back. I wish I were being poetic. 3 weeks after the last encounter, the one with the photo plate that cracked itself like it had seen too much, Blackwood finally snapped. Sleep-deprived, rationalizing, and probably half-caffeinated on cold tea and Victorian hubris, he returned to Cold Hollow. This time with medical instruments and that classic delusion every scientist clutches like a security blanket. I can explain this. I first came across Blackwood's records in a rotting cabinet behind the closed-off infirmary. My cousin dared me to break in one summer when we were teenagers. I still remember the smell. Formaldehyde, mildew, and something else. Something coppery. And there, buried under dusty charts, was a leather-bound notebook that simply read, E. Whitlow, Final Examination. Cut to dramatized, whispered narration. Like someone's reading from the notebook. I asked the boy how he felt. He told me, old. Tired in a way sleep cannot cure. Then he said he remembered lives that weren't his. A soldier in a war that hadn't happened yet. A woman dying in childbirth. An old man in a garden he'd never seen. Let me just pause here and say, that's not how 11-year-olds talk. That's how haunted graveyards whisper at you when you're alone and way too far from your car. But Blackwood, bless his stubborn soul, kept going. He checked Elias's reflexes, normal at first, but then he looked into the boy's pupils and saw something looking back. Not the ceiling, not his own reflection, a dark void packed with eyes, watching, unblinking, patient. He dropped his light, clattered like a gunshot. Elias didn't flinch. You saw them, didn't you? Elias asked. They're always there, just behind my eyes, waiting for their turn to look out. Yeah, totally fine. Nothing horrifying about that at all. Soft background hum, a distant heartbeat, slowing unnaturally. The examination didn't get better. Drawing Elias's blood was like trying to pierce leather. The needle met resistance, not skin, something denser, older. The blood, thicker than it should be. Too dark. Not the rich red of life, but the murky black of something that should not be moving anymore. When did you realize you weren't normal? Blackwood asked. Elias thought for a moment, like he was choosing the right ghost from a filing cabinet. Around 7. That's when I started remembering the others clearly. The first memory was from Thomas Whitlow, a great-grandfather he'd never met, died at Gettysburg. Elias remembered the feel of the bullet, the reek of blood-soaked wool, the cannon smoke curling like serpents through the air. That's not imagination. That's possession with subtitles. Dr. Blackwood, ever the rationalist, muttered something about genetic memory. a desperate gasp in the drowning pool of logic. But Elias corrected him. I'm not inheriting them, doctor. I'm collecting them. Every Whitlow who died with unfinished business. They come to me. I'm a repository. That word stuck with me. A repository. Not a boy. Not even a vessel. Just a vault. For everything dead that refused to stay buried. And here's the worst part. This wasn't an isolated case. There's a report from a Virginia sanitarium in 1862. A girl named Lillian Bird. Same symptoms, ageless, emotionally detached, and could quote scripture in Latin she never learned. She also had a habit of drawing people's portraits before they arrived. She disappeared after the Civil War. Some think she was buried. Others think she found someone else to collect her. Sound familiar? So, what do we do with a child who carries the psychic leftovers of generations? A boy who remembers death more clearly than his own birthday? Cold Hollow never found the answer. They just locked the infirmary, sealed the records, buried the fear under donations and denial. And Elias? Well, he's still listed in town records. Same height, same weight, same date of birth. For the last 147 years. Low crackling static, like an old tape restarting. You can't study what doesn't want to be understood. Blackwood wrote in his final entry, you can only witness and pray it doesn't look back. He never returned to Cold Hollow. Some say he left medicine altogether. Others say he tried to forget what he saw in Elias's eyes. I don't think he ever could, because once something looks through you, you never quite feel alone again. They say the dead speak in dreams. But Cold Hollow, Massachusetts? They whisper through a boy. And yeah, I wish that sounded more poetic. Less like something scraped off a Victorian seance pamphlet. But I've seen what's behind his eyes. I grew up 6 miles from Cold Hollow. My grandmother used to volunteer at St. Joseph's Orphanage back in the 60s. She told me once, after 2 vodkas and a stroke scare, some kids don't grow. Some kids remember too much. I thought she meant trauma, but now I'm not so sure. Scroll letter. Fragment from the Blackwood Journal, 1891. The child told me he remembers 17 lives, all bearing the Whitlow name. He claims he feels each death as if it were his own. I do not sleep. I dare not dream. Dr. I. Blackwood. Studio microphone. Narration continues. Let's rewind. Dr. Blackwood had just finished the worst physical exam of his career, the kind where your stethoscope picks up a heartbeat that sounds off, not slow, not erratic, just wrong, like it's counting time in some language your brain was never meant to understand. He'd asked Elias a simple question. How long have you been like this? And Elias, small, pale, far too calm, gave him the answer no rational man ever wants to hear. I came back. But I brought others with me. It wasn't a metaphor. Elias explained it like someone explaining a weird allergy. Casual, patient, almost embarrassed for inconveniencing you. Every Whitlow who died with unfinished business. The suicides, the forgotten soldiers, the quietly bitter grandmothers. They clung to him, like regrets with teeth. Anchored not to the afterlife, but to him. Through him they saw, felt, lived again. Studio microphone, dry aside, sarcastic tone. Now, if this were some quaint BBC documentary, this would be the part where we cut to an expert saying, well, obviously the boy was suffering from a form of ancestral dissociative identity disorder. Yeah. No, there's no diagnosis for haunted meat suit with a family plan. Studio microphone, narration resumes, lower tone, 17. That's how many lives Elias claimed lived inside him at that point. 17 memories of death, of grief, of watching your own blood soak into some godforsaken piece of American soil. He didn't just remember Gettysburg, he felt the lead punch through Thomas Whitlow's chest. He heard the cannons before he knew what a war was. Elias wasn't aging because he wasn't just Elias. He was a composite, a spiritual archive held together by skin, bone, and something older than science. Wind face, sound design. Faint wind howling, like it's moving through hollow corridors. Outside, the wind tore down Cold Hollow's main street like it was hunting something. or someone. People said it howled before the mines collapsed in 74. Same sound. Same direction. Inside, Dr. Blackwood sat like a man who'd stared too long at something he wasn't supposed to name. His notes became more erratic after that. In fact, most of his journal entries from this point on end with phrases like, "I heard whispering in my sleep. His blood is darker now. They're watching through his eyes." Latin cross, new perspective. Father McKenna's arc begins. Let's shift the lens. Father Brendan McKenna had buried more men than most coroners. 37 years on the edge of civilization, and he still believed God had a plan. That's the kind of faith you only get from surviving both Indian raids and Irish guilt. But Elias broke something in him. It started with small things. The boy stopped casting shadows in full moonlight. Another child wet himself just from sharing a dormitory wall. One nun claimed Elias prayed in Latin he shouldn't have known, asking mercy for souls who died before the United States was a country. McKenna wrote in his own journal, "He speaks in tongues, but not the ones from Scripture. His presence is like a draft beneath a locked door." Studio microphone. Narrator. Final reflection. Elias Whitlow wasn't aging, because he wasn't supposed to. He was, and maybe still is, a vessel. A living reliquary of dead Whitlows too stubborn to let go. Their regrets became his memories. Their wounds became his silence. And Cold Hollow? Well, it's one of those towns that exists quietly off old maps. The kind where the post office closes early and no one questions why every mirror in the orphanage is draped in black cloth. Because some secrets aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be survived. You ever feel a room go cold, even when the sun's pouring through the windows? That was March 3rd, 1892, a Sunday. Elias Whitlow walked into St. Ignatius Church for the first time in 3 months. Morning Mass had just started. Father McKenna was halfway into a sermon about redemption, the usual comfort food theology, when the door creaked open and Elias slipped in. Didn't say a word. Just sat in the back pew like he'd always belonged there. And the air? Changed. Visibly. Studio microphone. Dry aside. Sarcastic tone. The official record says the temperature in Cold Hollow that morning was 42 degrees. Unofficially, ask anyone who stayed for the sermon what little of it there was. Mothers pulled their kids close like the boy was radioactive. 3 entire families just left. Didn't even wait for the hymns. Just grabbed their coats and made up excuses about roast lamb or laundry or whatever felt less blasphemous than, "I don't want my child sitting in a room with a time-haunted corpse child. Can't say I blame them." Headphone ambient. Soft murmurs, wood creaking. A faint wind outside the church. Father McKenna. Man of God, frontier priest, seen more death than most undertakers. Tried to keep preaching. But the words crumbled on his tongue. It's hard to talk about divine salvation when you're being stared down by someone with 17 lifetimes behind their eyes. Elias wasn't glaring, wasn't smiling, just watching, like he'd seen this sermon before, multiple times, from multiple pulpits. Scroll, quote, letter from McKenna's personal diary, 1892. I saw myself reflected in that boy's gaze, not as I am, but as I will be. Old, hollowed out, uncertain. Studio microphone. Narration resumes. Lower tone. After the service, what was left of it? Everyone rushed out like the walls might collapse. Except Elias. He stayed. Sat alone in the pew, bathed in stained glass light that didn't quite seem to touch him. Father McKenna approached. Slowly, like a man approaching a sleeping snake he once baptized. He said, "You've been avoiding church, my son." And Elias, without missing a beat, "I've been waiting for the right time to have this conversation." Studio microphone. First-person anchor. Narrator's personal tie-in. My uncle used to say Elias was like a mirror that blinked. He was a kid on the outside, pale, polite, unnervingly still. But when you spoke to him, it was like throwing your voice into a well filled with other voices. That morning, Father McKenna found that out the hard way. Studio microphone. Dialogue reenactment. naturalistic tone. Elias, you've been questioning your faith because of me. McKenna stammering, my faith is strong. It's just that you present certain theological challenges. Elias, gently, I present proof that your understanding of life and death is incomplete. And that terrifies you. Studio microphone, dry aside, cutting sarcasm. Terrifies you is an understatement. McKenna once performed last rites during an Apache siege without flinching. But here, the man was clutching his rosary like it was a flare gun. Church sound. Footsteps on stone. Pews creaking. Elias's voice echoing slightly too much. Elias stood, walked to the front of the church. Every step sounded heavier than it should have. Like someone else or someone's were walking with him. Then he said, I remember being baptized 17 times. I remember taking communion with hands that killed men in wars you'll never read about. I remember confessing sins that haven't even happened yet. Studio microphone, narration, rising tension. McKenna backed away. His skin had gone bone white. You can't prepare for a theological discussion with a time fracture dressed as a child. He tried to regain control. Shouted, You weren't even born when I was ordained. And Elias just looked at him, with a flicker of something older than patience, and said, Would you like to know what I remember about it? Studio microphone, historical case, disturbing detail. 1 week later, McKenna handed his resignation to the bishop. No explanation. He boarded a train to St. Louis and was never seen again in Cold Hollow. The church records list it as early retirement. But a private letter sent to the archdiocese tells a different story. Scroll. He knew things no child could. My thoughts, my sins, my vows. I no longer believe in death as a mercy, nor in time as a comfort. The boy is a rupture, not a soul. I fear he is what awaits us when purgatory fails. B. McKenna, March 1892. Studio microphone, closing narration, hushed, unsettling. There's a silence in Cold Hollow now. People avoid the back pew. They don't ask what happened to Father McKenna. And they definitely don't ask where Elias goes on the Sundays he doesn't show up. But if you listen, just after the bells you might hear it. Footsteps that don't echo quite right. A child's voice speaking in a language that tastes like rust. And if you ever see a boy who doesn't blink, just keep walking. Because whatever Elias Whitlow is, he doesn't pray. He remembers. March 6, 1901. Notes found in the back of Father Timothy McKenna's Bible. He looked at me with 17 sets of eyes, and I couldn't tell which one was God's. Let me tell you about the moment faith buckled like rotten wood under the weight of something it was never built to hold. It was a Sunday because of course it was. Cold Hollow's only church, St. Bridget's, smelled like mildew and incense, and the pews were polished just enough to leave splinters if you prayed too long. That morning Elias Whitlow walked in. 11 years old, shoelaces untied, hair combed with something resembling hope. He slipped into the back pew just as Father McKenna began preaching on redemption and eternal life. Classic Sunday fluff. The kind of sermon you give when the town needs comfort more than conviction. Except, the room shifted. That literally. People flinched. Mothers clutched their children tighter like he was a wasp they couldn't swat in front of God. And before the scripture could even hit Leviticus, half the congregation ghosted out. But Elias stayed. After the service, with nothing left but the creaking of the floorboards and that heavy, guilty silence churches do so well, McKenna finally approached him, prayer book trembling in his hands, sweat dotting his collar. You've been avoiding church, my son, he said. Elias, bless him, didn't even blink. I've been waiting for the right time to have this conversation. The priest's face did this thing, like someone had just whispered heresy directly into his eardrum. You've been questioning your faith because of me? Elias continued, voice flat but heavy, like a grown man dragging a lifetime of regret in a child's lungs. Father McKenna tried to deny it, tried to recite something vaguely holy sounding about strength and belief. But when a kid tells you he's remembered being baptized 17 times, each time by a different priest in a different century, it kind of ruins your homily. Elias wasn't just waxing poetic either. He spoke of holding weapons in wars you've never heard of confessing sins that haven't been committed yet. His words weren't metaphor, they were memories. And here's the kicker. He knew about McKenna's doubts. Knew that back in Denver, 1873, Thomas Whitlow, Elias's great-grand ghost or whatever you want to call him, had been hammering pews and watching a young, nervous priest take his vows with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He saw you wonder if you were truly called to this life, Elias said, or if you were just running from something else. Now pause here. Imagine being told your deepest, darkest existential dread. The thing you buried under 30 years of sacraments and rosary beads didn't stay buried. It got inherited. McKenna dropped his prayer book. Didn't even hear it hit the floor. That's when Elias did something subtle but horrific. His actual face shifted. Just for a second. Not like morphing clay or some VFX nonsense. More like an old photograph double exposed over a living thing. An older man's eyes inside a boy's sockets. Gettysburg in the background. He died believing God had abandoned him, Elias whispered. Now I carry that doubt too. Let that sink in. Every regret, every unanswered prayer, every godless scream from every Whitlow ancestor. Stacked up inside one kid. That's not reincarnation. That's hoarding. Father McKenna, bless his unraveling soul, asked the obvious. Are you blessed or cursed? A miracle or an abomination? Elias didn't have an answer. Just 17 different voices in his head. None of which belonged to him. And then came the real horror. He told McKenna that more were coming. Not ghosts, not hauntings, but people's souls from future wars, unknown places, unspoken traumas. Whitlows who hadn't even died yet. They were on their way, drawn to him like moths to a dying flame. Let me break from the narrative for a second and say this. In my grandmother's cedar chest, the one we found after she passed, there was a letter dated 1902, signed by Reverend Timothy McKenna. He wrote, "The child is no longer a child. He is a reliquary, and I fear he will not be the last." There was also a photo, stained, blurry, the kind that smells like ash and vinegar, of Elias standing in that same church, alone at the altar. You could almost make out faces behind him in the stained glass. Faces that didn't belong. Maybe the dead aren't resting. Maybe they're waiting for a vessel. I wasn't supposed to be here. The others are going home now. Thank you for trying to understand. Message burned into oak, Elias Whitlow's room, March 21st, 1883. So, here's the part of the story where even the skeptics start squirming. March 21st, 1883. Cold Hollow, Montana. Temperature biting. Wind aggressive like it had a grudge. The kind of morning where the frost doesn't just cling. It creeps, making the floorboards brittle and the walls sweat with something that wasn't quite condensation. Mrs. Abernathy, the sort of woman who ironed handkerchiefs and feared the Lord with the efficiency of a tax auditor, discovered Elias's bed empty. Not unmade. Empty. The blanket was folded back with eerie precision. The pillow still dented from the weight of a not quite 11-year-old head. And yet, no footprints, no scuffs, no frost disturbed on the hallway floors. Just cold silence. He's gone. That's what she said when Father McKenna arrived. Her voice was shaky. Not the way people sound when a kid runs away. The way they sound when something's taken. Cut to narrator, first person. I found the incident report buried in a box of church files donated to a historical society. The kind of donation meant to quietly get rid of a problem under the guise of preservation. My grandmother used to work at Cold Hollow when it was still an orphanage in the 1950s. She said the West Wing never stayed warm, even with the boiler roaring. There were drafts, she'd say, and sometimes voices. Back in 1883, the only thing left behind in Elias's room, besides the bone-deep chill, was a message carved into the wall above his bed. Burned. Into. Not scratched. Not chiseled. Not written in crayon or some precocious early attempt at pyrography. Burned. Like the wood itself had blistered into letters. The heat still radiated when they touched it. I wasn't supposed to be here. What exactly do you do with a message like that? Other than pretend it doesn't exist and pray it doesn't happen again? Naturally, Dr. Blackwood, Mr. Rationality himself, insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Because obviously, when a child with 17 ancestral souls goes missing without leaving a trace in a locked building, it's probably just sleepwalking, or a gust of wind, or some light midnight carpentry with a side of spontaneous combustion. There has to be a rational explanation. Sure, document. Let's hear it. Except, every window was still latched from the inside, doors locked, no signs of tampering, and all the other children, sound asleep, undisturbed, like nothing supernatural had crept through the halls that night whispering to the dark. But something had, and it had taken Elias. Father McKenna ran his fingers over the burned words. He later wrote in a letter, which, by the way, I found folded behind a pew panel warped by water damage and guilt. I felt heat, still pulsing, like the wall itself remembered what had been done to it. The room stank of ash and cedar and something older, something like scorched bone. The priest tried to pray that day. He failed. He knelt beneath the stained glass crucifix, but the light didn't feel holy anymore. Felt filtered, like something was watching from behind it, too old to blink, too patient to speak. The kind of presence you don't see, but feel pressing behind your eyes. A pressure that says you were never in control of this story anyway. Here's where things spiral. 1 month after Elias vanished, another case surfaced in Cedar Pass, Wyoming, 400 miles south. A boy named Abraham Whitlow, age 7, was found standing outside an abandoned silver mine at dawn, mud-caked, silent, eyes wide. When the local sheriff asked him where he'd come from, the boy reportedly said, "Elias sent me back. He says it's getting crowded in there. No birth records, no missing persons report, just appeared." And the boy aged backwards over the following year. He was dead by winter, bones smaller than they should have been. A medical anomaly, they said. But we know better, don't we? Cold Hollow tried to move on. Churches resumed services. The orphanage cleaned the room. They sanded the wall. But the letters never left. Even now, if you shine a light just right in Elias's old room, you'll see them. Still glowing faintly beneath the paint, like embers waiting for breath. And every March 21st, the wind in Cold Hollow howls a little louder. It carries names no one remembers, and the souls of Whitlows who never truly left. Let me tell you about the morning the walls of Cold Hollow's orphanage decided they'd had enough. March 21st, 1883. Overcast. Bitter wind. The kind of cold that isn't just weather, it's warning. Inside, the building was quiet. Too quiet. And not in the kids must be sleeping way. More like this something just unhooked reality kind. It started just after Father McKenna and Dr. Blackwood were trying, and failing, to make sense of Elias's disappearance. And that's when it began. That voice. I wasn't supposed to be here. Soft at first. Too soft. Like a whisper sliding under floorboards or leaking out of a cracked window. And it wasn't just a voice. It was his, Elias's, but it was everywhere. No source. No origin. Just a disembodied child's voice bouncing around the hallways like it owned the place. Mrs. Abernathy went pale. Gripped her rosary like it was a weapon. Father McKenna started muttering Latin, which, let's be honest, has never once made a ghost go, "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to haunt." And Dr. Blackwood? He did what scientists do best in these situations. Flailed around and looked for speakers that didn't exist. But then the voice multiplied. I wasn't supposed to be here. Again, again, again. Louder now. Different pitches, different accents. Some voices cracked with age. Others young and lilting. A sickly choir of displaced souls echoing through the walls. Mrs. Abernathy asked the question none of them wanted to answer. Where are the other children? Because yeah, there were 12 other kids living in that orphanage. Kids who had gone to bed the night before. Beds that were now empty. Belongings untouched. No footprints. No drafts. Just that damn voice. Multiplying. They searched the entire building like mad. Bedrooms, closets, under floorboards, inside chests. Nothing. Just three very terrified adults. And the chorus. We weren't supposed to be here. It was not merely a haunting. It was a reckoning. I believe now that Elias was not alone. None of them were. And we were the ones intruding, not them. Eventually, word got out. It always does. Mayor Webb showed up. And because this is 1883 Montana, he brought half the town with him. Pitchforks included, probably. They stood in the courtyard, heads tilted, listening. The voices hadn't stopped. They'd evolved. Now it was like walking through 1,000 conversations, all happening at once. Papa never came home from the river. She buried me in the cellar. Told the neighbors I ran away. He promised not to send me back. Just fragments. Snapshots of trauma, regret, horror. Voices that didn't sound remembered, they sounded lived. Mayor Webb puffed out his chest and asked, "What in God's name is happening here?" And McKenna, who by this point had seen enough to give any horror protagonist PTSD for life, just said, "I think this was always going to happen." Candle. Narrator. Personal anchor. This is the part one struggle with. Because my grandmother, she worked at Cold Hollow for 11 years. She never talked about it. Not once. Just one time, she mentioned a boy who used to hum old hymns in the cellar. Songs no one taught him. And then she'd mutter, "He wasn't right in the eyes. Too old." I thought she was talking about some creepy memory. Turns out she meant literally. Back in the orphanage, Dr. Blackwood, our poor man of science, still held on to what little reality he had left. Children aren't vessels for the dead, he insisted. But McKenna? He'd already crossed that line. Think about it, doctor. How many of these children had no known family? How many arrived here under mysterious circumstances? How many spoke about wars they never could have lived through? Because that was the question no one wanted to ask. What if this orphanage wasn't for children? What if it was a waiting room? What if Cold Hollow had spent years housing lost souls, stitched into borrowed flesh, tucked into small beds with wool blankets and warm porridge? Like that was enough to make them forget. But it wasn't. 13 children, all unaccounted for. No bodies. No signs of departure. All windows locked from the inside. All doors sealed. Only the voices remained, and then, not even those. The crowd didn't leave that night. Some stayed just to listen. Others out of fear. A few out of guilt, maybe. But by morning, the voices were gone. Not faded. Gone. The building, too. The orphanage caught fire exactly 1 year later. No cause ever determined. Burned to the foundation. All that remained was one blackened beam, still bearing the faint marks of carved letters. Thank you for trying to understand. I found that beam in my uncle's basement. He used it as a coat rack. Still smells like smoke. Sometimes, when it's quiet, I hear humming. There's a kind of silence that doesn't mean peace. It means finality. It means whatever was here is gone. And whatever it left behind doesn't need words anymore. That's the silence Cold Hollow was left with in March of 1883. Not the comfortable kind you get after a snowstorm or a funeral. This was the kind that hums under your skin, like something still listening. The last voice anyone heard from the orphanage belonged to Elias Whitlow. You remember him, the boy with 17 souls and one face that somehow managed to look both 12 and ancient. I wasn't supposed to be here either, Elias said, calmly, like he just finished a long shift in purgatory. But I was needed for a little while, to help the others find their way. Now we can all rest. And with that, nothing. Just wind. Just the groaning bones of the building. Just silence so heavy you could hear your own blood move. I found that quote in a letter written by Father McKenna, tucked inside the back cover of a hymnal left behind in the church. Scrawled in the margins were the words, "If you ever hear him again, don't follow. Some doors are only meant to open once." The town, bless its paranoid little heart, wasted no time. They boarded up the orphanage, officially abandoned due to structural decay, which is Cold Hollow code for absolutely cursed, and we're not talking about it. No one's touched it since, unless you count teenagers trying to impress each other with beer and Ouija boards. But what happened next was almost stranger than the haunting. Father McKenna quit the church. Just walked away one morning like he'd misplaced God behind the altar and decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Moved to Wyoming. Opened a small bookstore. Specialized in folklore and postmortem photography. Dr. Blackwood, the rational one. Yeah, he burned his research. All of it. Years of medical journals, personal notes, and something titled The Compounding Effect of Prolonged Soul Saturation in the Human Vessel. He never published again. Took up silent retreats. Grew herbs. Died at 47 with a mirror nailed to the ceiling of his bedroom. Make of that what you will. And Mrs. Abernathy? She moved to California, changed her name, started a daycare, and refused to accept children who had no birth certificates. Which honestly seems fair. But the weirdest part isn't the disappearances, or the psychic chorus of orphan voices, or even the quote burned into the wall by a boy who shouldn't have existed. The weirdest part is how it stopped. Clean. No bodies. No footprints. Just nothing. If you ask the locals, and they'll shrug like it's folklore. But then they'll glance toward the old lot like something might still be standing there. Something invisible. Something listening back. They say sometimes, when the wind scrapes wrong through the alleyways, you can still hear him. Elias. Just a whisper. I wasn't supposed to be here. No kidding, kid. Most of us aren't. But we fake it until something drags us back through the veil, or a priest, a doctor, and a housekeeper accidentally host a supernatural group therapy session. My grandmother worked in Cold Hollow's record office in the 50s. She used to file birth and death certificates the old way by hand. One night she came home pale, quiet, wouldn't eat. When I asked what was wrong, she handed me a brittle page, thin, yellowing, like it had been pulled from a furnace. It was a death record. Name, Elias Whitlow. Date of death, March 21st, 1883. But at the bottom, someone had written in faint pencil. No official time, no body, just the quiet. She never brought it up again. But she did move our whole family 30 miles east that same year. Coincidence? Yeah, sure. Elias is gone now. At least that's what we tell ourselves. And Cold Hollow moved on, mostly. The church was rebuilt. The snow still falls. The living keep pretending the dead don't whisper when no one's listening. But me, I don't walk past that place. Not in daylight. Not in dreams. Because in Cold Hollow, some echoes don't fade. Some kids never grow up. And some souls? They just wait for someone else to forget why the doors were locked in the first place.